Joining me here in Canberra for his take on Newspoll and the campaign to date is political editor at the Australian newspaper, Dennis Shanahan. Are you exhausted yet?
No, I'm actually quite enlivened. I think people who say this has been a dull campaign, I don't know, it is a very tight campaign. It's actually quite interesting to see these seat-by-seat fights, and it's going to come down to just a few seats deciding the election. So, no, I think it's been an exciting campaign.
What's your take out of Newspoll? Because, as I said at the top of the show, it's interesting, and when I was writing the editorial and looking back at where the coalition has started in that last week in recent federal elections, other than Malcolm Turnbull's race in 2016, almost every single one of them, the coalition has improved its numbers, primary vote numbers, over that last week. If it does, obviously that's danger for Labor.
Oh, certainly. And in fact, if you include even 2016 and go back to the beginning of the campaign, every one of the last 5 campaigns, the coalition has improved its primary vote during the campaign. It's ended up better than it was at the beginning. There is clear, look, it's clear from Newspoll that Labor is the favourite. They're in front on two-party preferred, and Bill Shorten had quite a good boost in his popularity, his personal standing. But of course, Labor argues that his unpopularity is built in, so that doesn't really affect the vote. But I think the key here, and again, it shows up in the primary vote in Newspoll, is that the coalition still has momentum. It's a sluggish momentum, it's incremental, but it has a momentum in building its primary vote. It's still on 39, which is too low for it to win government in its own right, as is Labor's primary vote at 37, too low for them to win. But the time for, or the question for Scott Morrison really is he going to run out of time before he can actually build that momentum and convert it into a victory? There is no doubt both sides can feel how tightened the campaign has become. Both sides are even beginning to think in the back of their heads this could be a minority government, and they may have to negotiate to actually see who sits on the government benches.
To me, it feels a lot like the 2010 campaign, Dennis, where there had been a change of Prime Minister. People were still getting to know Julia Gillard, just like they are still getting to know Scott Morrison. Very much with Morrison, they like what they see. It's a different man, perhaps, than they've seen as the Immigration Minister / Treasurer. I agree with Labor. They have factored in the general dislike of Bill Shorten, much the same that Tony Abbott was not popular in 2010. But it was such a big race in those last few days. If you remember, Abbott did the 48 hours and all that sort of building of momentum right through to polling day. I suspect we'll see the same thing here. Now, the risk for Labor is that they could fall short, or the risk for Scott Morrison also is you're in a hung parliament scenario, particularly with the wild card of all these independents. How do you think that might all play out?
Well, look, I think that obviously both leaders yesterday, are appealing to people to vote one. Don't vote for the independents. They're both saying vote for us first, don't vote for Greens or Palmer or One Nation on the other side. So they're both recognising they have to maximise their primary vote, which, as I said before, is too low for them to win in their own right. So they're both trying to push that. They can both recognise the importance of that, and they're both taking out insurance. We saw Scott Morrison particularly rip into the Greens on the weekend, and of course Bill Shorten has maintained his attacks on Clive Palmer and One Nation, because they're both thinking if there is a minority government, we have to actually tarnish the people who are going to help them get into government if there's a negotiation underway. So Bill Shorten is now talking about the Clive Palmer, One Nation, Scott Morrison coalition, and of course Scott Morrison's talking about the Labor Greens alliance. So I think both sides, you see where they're going. You can see the seats that they're going into. There are possibly 17 or 18 seats where it's too close to call. both sides, and I think they're genuine when they say, look, we just don't know. We think it's 50-50. We've got no idea where it's going.
And also, too, I think, Dennis, I have to jump in there, because it's getting harder to accurately poll, in my view, I think that's why these seats are so opaque. I think they are contested seats. I think they could go either way. The margins certainly say they could go either way, but I don't think they've got, either side, a great read on where these seats will go come Saturday.
Yeah, I think that there is an element of people. We've seen this before with One Nation's vote. One Nation has tended to poll lower than it's actually registered its vote. We saw that particularly in Queensland.
We saw this in Brexit, and we saw this in the recent US election. Particularly if they're getting voice polls, if a human being is talking at them, they don't want to disclose they're voting for someone that's been demonised by the media, so they quietly pass, or we give, I guess, a dummy result, but they vote the other way inside the
when the time comes. And look, I think that the most likely result is still a very narrow Labor victory. The least likely result is a clear or a narrow coalition victory. But we're actually coming up to the stage where a hung parliament is almost more likely than either of those scenarios.
And what about mandate then, though? Because we saw this in 2010. You know, the claims of mandate, when you barely scrape over the line, and in fact Julia Gillard had less seats in the parliament than the coalition did, but she clearly won the negotiation. And then to try and bring in things like a carbon tax. How would Labor bring in radical changes to franking credits, negative gearing, and of course the climate policy?
Well, I think that Labor, because of the extent of its agenda, and it has been brave, it's put out a very big agenda, it's going to ask a lot. Even if it has a clear majority in the House, it is already going to face difficulty in the Senate. If it's got to negotiate through the House as well as the Senate, Labor has more to lose, I think, from minority government. Now, Bill Shorten may appear to be better at being a transactional deal maker, and so he may think that he's a better person to handle minority government than Scott Morrison. But I think that the size of Labor's agenda makes it much more difficult for Labor to govern in minority than Scott Morrison.
Someone said to me over the weekend, this is a Labor person, that if Bill gets where they think, somewhere 6 or 7 in terms of majority, that makes him vulnerable to face the next election. I'm not saying that they would take him out in the term, because they've now obviously had a rule change, but the pressure would be applied if he can't improve during that term, particularly how he is seen personally as a would-be then Prime Minister. He would be transitioned out and then be a new leader for the next election. How likely is that?
I don't think that's very likely. I think if Bill Shorten wins, no matter by how much, he will govern through. And I also think that he could very well grow into the role of Prime Minister, as Prime Ministers tend to do, and he could very well end up. I think people who are predicting, you know, one term are really underselling Bill Shorten's ability to grow into his job. We saw how he progressed on Leader of the Opposition. So I think that it's less likely that he would face some sort of a challenge. And of course, on the other side, if Scott Morrison does get back, even as a minority leader, given the position he was in, and he actually said it today, he said, where were we 8 months ago? He will have greater authority than perhaps John Howard had when he was elected in 1996. I think if he does get back, he will be in a solid leadership position. It's too bad that we don't have a sort of a switch where the Liberals have a pretty vast and strong policy agenda to deliver, because I think they'd be in a better position to do so than Labor.
Yeah, it will be very interesting. You're absolutely right about Scott Morrison. He'd come back with wind in his sails. They will see a very different Prime Minister if that was the case.